What if France never colonized Africa? What would the world look like if France never colonized Africa? French colonization played a pivotal role in shaping Africa's economies, politics, and cultures, and had a ripple effect that extended far beyond the continent. By peering into this alternative past, we confront complex questions about autonomy, resilience, exploitation, and opportunity. To understand the gravity of this question, we need to begin with context. In the late 19th century, during the scramble for Africa, European powers raced to divide the continent. France emerged as one of the leading players, claiming vast territories stretching from North Africa to West Africa, seizing control of modern-day nations like Senegal, Algeria, Mali, and the Ivory Coast. France's motivations were both strategic and exploitative. The extraction of resources, gold, rubber, oil, and agricultural goods, fueled its economy. French officials imposed their language, religion, and systems of governance, profoundly altering local cultural and societal structures. For decades, millions endured exploitation, forced labor, and systemic erasure of their heritage under French rule. But what if none of this had occurred? What paths might African nations have charted on their own, without external interference? And how would a France without its colonial enterprise evolve in its influence on the global stage? Exploring these questions requires us to examine economic, political, and cultural dimensions, both for Africa and the rest of the world. One of the most immediate effects of removing colonization from Africa's history is the preservation of political sovereignty for its nations. Before colonization, Africa was home to prosperous and complex kingdoms and empires, such as the Mali Empire, Songhai, and the Kingdom of Benin. These civilizations had elaborate systems of governance, trade, and diplomacy. Without French interference, these entities may have continued to grow, adapt, and evolve on their own terms. Instead of borders drawn arbitrarily by colonizers at the Berlin Conference, African nations might have maintained boundaries reflective of their historical identities. Strong alliances and regional coalitions may have emerged, fostering unity rather than the division sown by colonists. Yet, history is rarely linear. Africa likely would have encountered its own challenges: inter-kingdom rivalries, resource conflicts, and pressure from other global powers. But without the disruption of colonial systems, these struggles may have been addressed through African-led resolutions, not imposed by foreign rulers. French colonization extracted Africa's wealth for the benefit of European markets. Resources flowed out, profits rarely stayed. Imagine instead an Africa where those abundant natural riches, gold, diamonds, fertile lands, and oil, were retained and reinvested locally. With control over their own resources, African societies might have pioneered agricultural innovation, industrial development, and thriving trade networks. The cultural wealth of Africa, reflected in its art, crafts, and music, could have more directly funded and shaped their economies. Could we have seen an African industrial revolution, fueled by the ingenuity and resilience of its people? Alternatively, the absence of mutual trade protection agreements with colonial powers might have left African states vulnerable to exploitation by emerging global markets. Potential trade monopolies from other powers could have created new forms of economic dependence. Still, even with these challenges, the possibility of greater reinvestment in Africa's development suggests an alternative trajectory, one worth considering. One of the most profound effects of colonization was the cultural homogenization it enforced. French colonizers not only governed, but sought to assimilate. Indigenous languages were often replaced with French. Traditions were suppressed. Catholicism was heavily promoted at the expense of traditional African faiths and practices. Without French colonization, these dynamics would be starkly different. Indigenous languages and oral traditions, which in many cases have struggled for survival, might have thrived. Spiritual and philosophical systems deeply rooted in African culture could have continued evolving without disruption. Moreover, France's absence from the colonial narrative would raise an interesting question. How would Africa have engaged with the rest of the world culturally? Would African arts have reached the global stage earlier on their own strength? Could their storytelling, mythology, and scientific insights have shaped the perceptions of Africa in ways we can only imagine? If France hadn't colonized Africa, its own history would have played out differently. Colonization brought immense wealth to European nations, fueling industrial and infrastructure growth. Without access to Africa's wealth, would France have industrialized more slowly? Might it have refocused on its European neighbors, changing the dynamics of continental politics? France's cultural identity itself may have taken a different shape. Exchanges with Africa greatly influenced French art, cuisine, and literature. Think of African contributions to jazz and surrealism in the 20th century. These influences wouldn't exist in the same way without colonial interactions. Moreover, during major global conflicts like World War I and World War II, France relied heavily on colonies for resources and soldiers. Without African participation, France might have struggled harder during these wars, altering the power dynamics of the 20th century. While imagining a colonization-free Africa might sound idealistic, it's important to recognize the persistent challenges the continent might have faced. Rivalries between kingdoms and empires could have exacerbated tensions. Differences over resources, governance systems, and cultural identities could have sparked regional disputes. However, the absence of European-designed borders might have minimized some of today's enduring divisions. A key question is whether stronger inter-African dialogues, diplomacy, and coalitions could have emerged to effectively mediate these conflicts. Could African nations have developed their own unified systems of resource sharing and political cooperation? Would ideas of Pan-Africanism, a movement that gained traction during and after colonization, have evolved differently without colonial influence? Colonization led to forced migrations, most notoriously through the transatlantic slave trade, which devastated African societies and created an African diaspora that shaped global conversations on race, identity, and justice. Without French colonization, and potentially without European colonization as a whole, the African diaspora would likely be smaller and less widespread. This raises important questions. Would global narratives around Africa and its people be less tied to displacement and struggle? Could the notion of Pan-African identity, so deeply connected to fighting against colonial and racial oppression, have emerged at all without this shared history of trauma? Alternatively, Africans on equal cultural and economic footing with the rest of the world may have chosen to migrate globally in pursuit of shared opportunities or knowledge exchanges. Could they have built new kinds of diasporic connections rooted not in loss, but in mutual aspirations? As we explore these possibilities, it's essential to acknowledge the limitations of counterfactual reasoning. History is not a predictable domino chain, but an intricate weave of choices, circumstances, and external forces. Speculating about what might have been can expose possibilities, but it cannot offer definitive answers. Nonetheless, asking "what if" allows us to question dominant narratives and investigate how certain events shaped the course of history. In this way, reimagining an Africa untouched by French colonization forces us to confront the true costs of exploitation and the resilience it sparked. Ultimately, this exploration isn't confined to the past. The legacies of French colonization in Africa remain visible today, in post-colonial borders, in economies structured for foreign benefit, and in societies grappling with hybrid cultural identities. Understanding these legacies allows us to consider how different choices, whether made 150 years ago or today, can have far-reaching consequences. This exercise also prompts us to recognize Africa's agency, resilience, and potential, both historically and now. Even under the weight of colonization, African communities have persisted, innovated, and rebuilt. Reimagining a history without colonization reminds us of Africa's untapped potential, a future led not by external powers, but by Africa itself. So, what if France had never colonized Africa? Would we see a continent of thriving, autonomous nations, unburdened by colonial borders? Would Africa have become a dominant economic and cultural force, reshaping global dynamics? Or would the forces of imperialism simply have found other ways to impose themselves on the continent? These questions have no single answer, only endless possibilities, each provoking reflection on the intertwined histories of Africa, Europe, and the world. What's certain is that reimagining history helps us better understand the world we live in and reminds us of our responsibility to shape a future rooted in justice, opportunity, and respect for all. What do you think Africa's story would have been in an uncolonized world? Share your thoughts below, because history may have been written, but its lessons still live on. Like and subscribe for more from History Twist.